Hey guys, welcome to an episode of InRange. I was very kindly invited to be here in Houston, Texas at the Buffalo Soldier Museum by Jason and Kale. And they are curators here and archivists, and they know their stuff. So what we're here for this first video is at the Blue Helmets exhibit. And this is a whole wandering exhibit. It's going to travel around, but this is about really one of the first black divisions of the American Expeditionary Forces that were sent off to France to fight. But at the time, Pershing didn't want black soldiers, so what he did is he handed them over to the French High Command, and they were the ones that they ultimately fought under. There's already a video here on InRange about that, about the Red Summer of 1919, and some really horrible things that came as a result of that. So if you're interested in that topic, click here and you'll see that video, and that's a topic that's relevant to this. But what we're going to do today is talk about the experience of the Blue Helmets and what they went through, not only in World War I, but through their whole transition in the military. So I'm going to hand this over to Jason and Kale. You're not going to see me, you're going to see them, and you're going to see artifacts, so stay tuned.
All right, so my name is Cale Carter. I'm the director of exhibitions here. It's my partner.
Jason Fung, I'm the archivist of the museum.
And pretty much we're going to be talking about the history of the Blue Helmets, or the 93rd Infantry Division, both its history in World War I as well as in World War II. So we start here with this panel to kind of give a contextual history of the 93rd. The 93rd Division, or the 93rd Infantry Division, traces back to World War I. And during World War I, there was two black combat divisions that were raised. The 92nd Division, which was the only complete black combat division that had infantry, artillery, support units. But the 93rd, when it was raised, technically the 93rd was a provisional division, and it comprised primarily of a mixture of black National Guard units that came from New York, the Midwest, as well as the Deep South. And what made them unique was that, well, one, they was part of a provisional division, but then two, they pretty much spent their entire service under the command of the French army. Now, what is interesting is that the individual regiments that made up this provisional division, when they initially deployed, they each kind of had their own separate regimental patches. The 369th Infantry Regiment, better known as the Harlem Hellfighters, they had a coal rattlesnake. The 370th Infantry Regiment, they had a black devil, but then they started incorporating a blue French Adrian helmet towards the end of the war to kind of denote their service under the French command. And the 371st and 372nd Infantry Regiments, they had a red hand patch to denote their service under the French 157th. And so when the units started coming home, some of the units did switch over to the blue helmet patch. And the reason why they had the blue helmet patch is to denote their service under the command of the French army. But then also when they was attached to the French army, they were issued French equipment in spite of keeping their U.S. uniforms. So they were issued Horizon Blue Adrian helmets. They had Berthier rifles, the ammunition, and everything else. So pretty much they complete their service in World War I. The unit is then brought back to the United States and deactivated in 1919. World War I ends, the units come home, they're deactivated. And when World War II when we want to get involved in World War II, the U.S. Army starts trying to draw up plans to see, okay, how many divisions we're going to need. And originally they was planning to have at least 4 black combat divisions, but they end up reducing it down to 2, with the third one being raised later. And the first of these divisions would have been the 93rd Infantry, which was raised in May of 1942 at Fort Huachuca in Arizona.
Excellent points, Kale. But one thing I want to add that most people may not realize is that the 93rd Division was one of the first times African-American regiments that were raised were a combined arms division. In other words, they had infantry, artillery, and they had a logistical corps with them as well to support the troops. So this is the Browning automatic rifle, or the BAR. There are many videos about this gun, so I won't want to talk about the details or the specs of the gun, but I will tell you why it's important in this museum's display. The BAR is perhaps one of the most iconic American automatic rifles, and it set the trend. As you can tell watching InRange TV's Browning automatic rifle walking video, you can see how that was implemented as a means of suppressing fire. But ultimately, though, this gun revolutionized the way we have today's terms a squad automatic weapon. Before this weapon was introduced, a lot of the weapons we used during the war was semi-automatic and bolt action. The Barring automatic rifle was designed to augment the firepower of a American rifleman squad by adding 2 weapons that could suppress enemy fires to a squad to maximize its effectiveness. For those who don't know, the sport automatic weapon today is now being used as a proper machine gun, which can shoot many, many rounds instead of the 20 rounds that a bar can shoot.
So when we get to this panel right here, this is where we talk about the 93rd Infantry Division and its early training in World War II. So as I mentioned before, the 93rd Infantry Division was formed in Fort Huachuca, Arizona. And from May of 1942 to the spring of 1943, they pretty much spent their time at Fort Huachuca doing their initial training, bringing in their initial recruits, and kind of doing their initial divisional exercises. Prior to even them leaving Arizona, there was this situation that occurred during the fall of 1942, and it would continue until February 43. So in the fall of 1942, they was having an issue in Arizona about bringing in the cotton crop. There was an issue where the people who would normally bring in the cotton crop were either drafted for the service or were working in the war industry. So the government of Arizona had an issue trying to bring in that cotton crop. They tried numerous solutions. They tried to bring in people from Mexico to help bring in the crops. That didn't work. They tried to even get Japanese Americans who were in turn to bring in the cotton crop. That didn't work. So there was an idea that was pitched by the then governor of Arizona that said, where he reached out to the War Department and said, hey, cotton is essential to the war industry. If it's at all possible, can we get soldiers who are based in Arizona to help when they're not training to help bring in the cotton crop? So, and that's literally how the document was worded. Like any soldiers who were not busy training help bring in the cotton crop. However, the black press heard about it and they started like, wait a minute, like the 93rd is one of the largest units there. Like I said, keep it in mind at the time, an infantry division will be anywhere from 11,000 to anywhere like 15,000 at peak strength. And in addition to the 93rd, you also had the 364th Infantry Regiment, which was based in the area around Phoenix, Arizona. So on the surface, it came to the black press, like, wait a minute, this is kind of coming off as like, hey, they want black soldiers to pick cotton. And so when they got word about it, it became an entire press campaign that was levied, kind of highlighting and saying, hey, these soldiers are training for war. They need to be focused on going overseas, not picking cotton. And it actually led to where it was a black newspaper called the New York Amsterdam News that actually drew a political cartoon kind of satirizing the whole thing. What was called, Is This the Army of Mr. Jones? Where they show a black sergeant literally with his sergeant stripes out in the field picking cotton. So when this occurs, it's kind of a whole back and forth between the War Department, the governor of Arizona, and ultimately they say, okay, we're going to find another way to bring the cotton crop in. So literally before they even leave Arizona, there's already issues that they deal with. So then from there, they go from Arizona to Louisiana, persistent Louisiana maneuvers. And while they're there, they do conduct their training. They don't really have to deal with as much issues during that period, but there was concerns from some of the smaller towns like Manny and Leesville about this massive population of black soldiers being deployed nearby. And it says, as far as we know, in terms of current records, that there really wasn't any major incidents that came about during this time. Now, keep in mind that area, there were incidents before, like the Lee Street massacre that occurred in late 1941, early 1942. So, but after they finished their time in Louisiana maneuvers, which pretty much lasts from the spring to about midsummer 1943, they're then sent to Southern California to the Desert Training Center to conduct maneuvers there. And while they're there conducting maneuvers, this is where there's a kind of concern about, okay, where are we going to deploy this division at? There's kind of this thing where they're going to the Desert Training Center, so some of the soldiers are thinking, okay, maybe we're going to North Africa. But the commanders and the field army commanders, there was kind of a time saying, okay, well, where are we going to send this unit? Like, can we send them to Europe? Commanders say, well, we don't really have a need for those troops here. We already basically got our plans up in order. Can we send them to England? No, we already got our divisions in order. We don't need them here. So by the time the fall of 1943, the fall, winter of 43, 44 comes around, one of the commanders in the Pacific says, okay, well, we will take the 93rd as long as they can free up a division for free up another division that's continuing on in the island hopping campaign. Like during this time, early 1944, and especially in the South Pacific, they know they want to ultimately liberate the Philippines. And there's an idea to say, okay, well, we need some islands, some soldiers to help garrison these islands we already secured, as well as help with remnant forces there. So if the 93rd can take care of that, we would go ahead and take them, and in turn that could free up one of our more experienced divisions to go on to the Philippines.
So the importance of the 93rd in this particular aspect of stateside trading is actually very important when it comes to the racism and the Jim Crow aspect. Because there is this mythology playing around that the African-American soldier was not as good or was inferior to the white soldier, so to speak. The reality is a lot different than it actually is. Because, as you know, the American military is a bureaucracy. And through bureaucracy, there's a lot of paperwork and tests that need to be done. So the United States military at this time, during World War II, had an exam to sort of gauge the intelligence level of its soldiers. Because these soldiers did not meet the white expectation, they were thus labeled as inferior. But reality shows not so different, because at the end of the day, a good basic training foundation for a soldier is very important when it comes to engaging with the enemy. Stateside training that they did, they served at the Desert Training Center, and they did quite well there, although documents won't really cover the major outcomes, but we do know they successfully graduated their training there and were able to move on. And this desert training is going to be important because eventually the 93rd will be moved into a Pacific campaign theater, which there really isn't any desert out in the Pacific. It's all jungle terrains. And so this is that training example of they trained for a certain area to go to the deserts, thinking that they might go back to North Africa or to the plains of or mountains of Italy. In reality, they went to fight in the jungles of the Pacific theaters. And so that shift in how they trained and then the reality where they were stationed plays a very important role in how they could actually engage with the enemy. And also doesn't help that the military command has only really one standard of sort of addressing what units are combat effective versus what units can work during this time period.
All right, so when we talk about some of the artifacts we have from the 93rd Infantry Division, I actually find this one of the most interesting. And this actually allows us to talk about the significance of Black commissioned officers in the 93rd Infantry Division. So one of the common beliefs when it comes to Black units, both from World War I and World War II, is that Black units were comprised of Black enlisted soldiers and white officers. And in many cases that was true. However, when it came to World War II and a lot of Black combat units and even some Black support units, the idea was that at the very least you would have platoon level and company level commissioned officers. And in some cases, not really with the 93rd, but with the sister division, you actually have entire battalions that are commanded by Black officers. But when you talk about the Black officers in World War II, there's really two primary ways Black officers gain their commissions. The one primary method is through officer candidate school. You have a lot of senior enlisted and even some junior enlisted who spent years in the military who have experience. They are able to gain a commission and they become a junior commissioned officer that way. But then the other way was through Army ROTC programs, primarily held at historically Black colleges and universities. So in the case of like the 93rd, as well as other units, a lot of the Black Army commissioned officers came from places like Howard, Hampton, Tuskegee Institute, as well as many other HBCUs across the country. And again, when you think about the significance of this, is that while maybe at the divisional command staff level, you wouldn't see that many Black officers, when it came to the platoon level and even to a degree the company level, you would see Black officers. And on the one hand, it was seen as kind of a way to boost morale of Black soldiers, but at the same time too, there was also concerns about having Black officers, and this actually traces back to the Army War College study of 1925. So during the Army War College study of 1925, it was pretty much stated that in order to have a quote effective Black unit, you had to have only like Black enlisted and white officers, particularly white officers from the South, because it was believed that based on the experiences from World War I, that the black officers who were in charge did not know how to properly command their troops. Now, of course, what we know now from understanding of records now, that there's more nuance and context to that. But when you talk about World War II, you do see the proliferation of black officers. But as we will cover later in the exhibition, during the the skirmish at Hill 250, you kind of see some of the ghost of the Army War College study of 1925 come back into play when we talk about that battle. So after they complete their training in the Desert Training Center during the winter of 43, 44, they get orders to deploy. They get orders that they're basically shipping overseas. And in January 1944, they leave from California. And by February 44, they start arriving in Guadalcanal. So when they arrive at Guadalcanal, pretty much they go through a series of training. They have to basically, some of the combat elements go through jungle warfare training, which lasts for, depending on, some sources say it lasts for 2 months, some say it only lasted a month, because when the 93rd arrived, they were pretty much almost immediately was kind of pressed into labor detail. So helping offload ships, helping with the construction of facilities and stuff like that. And so they spend from February, March of 1944 on Guadalcanal doing a mixture of training as well as labor details. But then in April 44, late March 44, early April 44, the 25th Regimental Combat Team, which comprised of the 25th Infantry Regiment and the 593rd Field Artillery Battalion, they get orders that they're deploying to Bougainville. And the reason why they're deploying to Bougainville is because at that point we have airstrip that's there, and they're getting sent to help reinforce a defensive line against the remnant Japanese forces that are on the island. But also, their job there is to essentially root out the remnant Japanese forces, well, Imperial Japanese forces. Their idea is basically they seek to do this by essentially launching out kind of search and destroy mission. They have to go out, find where the Japanese forces will be at, and then ambush them, and vice versa. So when they arrive, this marks the first time that a black combat division is essentially going into combat. So when they arrive, there's a lot of camera crews from the Signal Corps, and in fact, there's recordings from New Zealand camera crews who are documenting like their initial actions. And when they perform their initial actions, so far most of the reports seem pretty well. But then around April 6th, April 7th of 1944, K Company of the 3rd Battalion of the 25th Regimental Combat Team, they're sent to essentially go out and conduct an ambush on suspected Japanese forces that are using a trail to move in and out of the area. And as soon as they break off to conduct missions, they come under fire. So they come under fire. Some forces are taking more fire than others. The company commander of K Company starts telling some people, okay, this platoon, you hold your position. Other platoon, you fall back to a certain so we can basically cover you. But because of how the orders are given and how the soldiers are receiving it in the field, it causes confusion. And so some soldiers are thinking, okay, well, we're taking heavy fire. If we stay here, we got to basically be cut off from Allied forces. We're going to get massacred. So let's go ahead, pull back. And ultimately, from the official report, they say that because of this, there's a lot of confusion and chaos, and that it literally takes someone calling in for fire support from the 593rd to suppress the fire, and that leads to an organized withdrawal. But once the guys start withdrawing back to Allied lines, there's automatically accusations of cowardice saying that, okay, well, some of these guys pulled back before the order was given. Because they pulled back, they're now following orders, and then this leads to accusations of cowardice. So, did you want to touch on anything before we move on to the other points?
So I do want to talk about the accusation of cowardice, because this is a very problematic kind of experience for a lot of soldiers under bad leadership, right? For those who don't know, this execution of this plan of falling back was designed to be a fallback and retreat kind of movement. It was supposed to be organized. At the end of the day, it was kind of poor communication on the commander's side. According to the documents that we've read, it was very much a attempt on having a successful fallback and engage kind of mentality. But because of the jungle terrain, you didn't have these clear passes for the fallback to be done, right? So a lot of these soldiers decided that they needed to of withdrawal. Otherwise, they would be left out and they'd be overstretched, and they would may not be able to return back to base. But in this report here, it is a great example of how the United States military sort of gauges what combat effectiveness is, right? Combat effectiveness for the U.S. military at this time was a lot about following orders, executing those orders, and then getting the objective completed, right? And so during this battle for the Hill 250, they weren't really able to achieve the objective of wiping out the Japanese, and they really weren't able to achieve their objective of following orders, as the retreat was drawn and it was a bad order to begin with. And lastly, they weren't able to sort of move with command. Command wanted something done and really didn't have the materials and supplies. You only had one company and very few supporting units to support it. So this was a kind of a bad situation all together. Because of the result of Battle 250, African Americans for this portrayal of Battle of Bougainville kind of had a not so good, favorable kind of experience when it comes to military and reporting of African American military efficiency. But overall, it wasn't the fault of the unit itself. It was simply bad leadership.
And see, to continue on to it. So after, like pretty much after they came back, there was literally a court-martial law and as well as an investigation, and it literally led to a mixture of kind of viewing other similar units with similar levels of training to see how they were impacted by similar situations. And then also, I said, keep in mind too, with the 93rd, they only had about a month's worth of jungle training, which anyone who fought and dealt any type of maneuvers in the jungle know that you're not only fighting the adversary, you're also fighting the jungle itself. So, but with the inquiry, they started looking into similar units, and they say there's even reports about how units report coming under fire and they retreat, or they didn't face any fire and they retreat back. And in the inquiry set you had where the company commander blamed the junior black officers and enlisted. The junior black officers and enlisted said, well, we received bad orders. And so while, like Jason said before, while the reports kind of point to the company commander not only giving out proper orders, they end up essentially making the black junior officers the scapegoat and moving on from there. But ultimately, in spite of this situation, the 25th Regimental Combat Team, especially other battalions, really do perform pretty well at their assigned objective. Like, one of the things that is kind of interesting too, and I think Jason, well, I know Jason brought this up when we was doing research, he made a point that I didn't even think about, how the 3rd Battalion, because of the way they tended to be employed, they probably would see the least amount of training when it came to Texas, whereas the 1st and 2nd Battalions would have received a lot more training. And it's ironic because when you look at the unit records, some of the most effective units come from the 1st and 2nd Battalion. And the 3rd Battalion, they still do an effective job even after this. It's just this one incident of miscommunication of orders and all this other, so that base kind of puts a black mark, not only on the 93rd, but some will say it put a black mark on black combat units in general, because as I mentioned before, this is the first time that a black combat division is going into combat. And so even though reports later say that, okay, well, we found these things, and while yes, this doesn't look too good, this is actually pretty commonplace, because they say, oh, this is a black unit that had these issues, it kind of becomes a shadow in the room that impacts other black units when they deploy to their respective theaters as well.
Because one of their successes that is often overlooked is that they captured a Japanese colonel, very, very alive. So as many historians are aware, Japanese military hierarchies like to do suicide runs. Yeah. They didn't like to be, but these men here, they successfully did it, and they were the only ones that were able to do so. So that was something that should be given more attention to, but because of this incident here, it tends to be overshadowed by it.
So when we get to this point in the exhibition, so we talk about the 93rd Infantry Division service after Bougainville. So pretty much after Bougainville, the 93rd was broken up, and the various components served on various island garrisons pretty much from this point until around April 1945. So, and again, in those island garrisons, they do a mix of guard details, labor details, like building fortifications. So And every now and then they do an odd patrol, but they don't really see as much combat action as they did initially on Bougainville. But that kind of changes when they're deployed to Morotai. So they're deployed to Morotai, which was then in the Dutch East Indies, but is now Indonesia. And when they arrived, the 93rd was put in charge of all the Allied ground forces that was on that island. And one of the objectives when they were deployed there, one of the initial objectives was to eliminate remaining Japanese resistance. And their idea of how to try to eliminate Japanese resistance was by essentially trying to capture the Japanese officer. Capture the officer in command that will basically cause the resistance to basically become disorganized and in theory melt away. So while they're conducting that, one of the elements of the 93rd Infantry Division, the 368, they're actually deployed to the southern Philippines. And they spend the time in the southern Philippines working closely with the Filipino forces to basically mop up Japanese resistance there. And it's pretty much while they're serving in the Philippines that the 98th Infantry Division receives the only Distinguished Service Cross recipient, which is Staff Sergeant Leonard Downing from New Orleans, Louisiana. Well, he receives the Distinguished Service Cross posthumously when his squad comes under heavy machine gun fire. They take casualties, and he tries to draw the fire of the heavy machine gun away from the squad. And he already takes some light wounds, so he tries to actually do a low crawl with a grenade to try to knock out the Japanese bunker to allow his forces to escape. And literally, when he's getting up to throw the grenade, he gets a mortal wound and he pretty much dies on the spot. But because of his sacrifice, the remaining elements of the squad was able to pull back their dead and wounded. So for his actions, they awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross. And this all occurred on Jolo around, I'll say like June, July 1945. So, but for the remaining of the Allied forces that were the 93rd that was on Morotai, as I mentioned before, their main objective was to eliminate Japanese resistance through capturing an officer. So they apparently had one of the elements. Reconnaissance teams actually kind of pinpoint where the Japanese officer was at, and according to some of the sources, the way they captured him was kind of silly. They actually caught him while he was drunk. So apparently they caught him while he was drunk, and they just like doink, and they captured him basically. So, but like I said, because one of the newspapers say that, oh, the guy came in there with an M1 carbine, one-handed. So it's a true from fiction, basically. But the interesting part about this is that, as Jason mentioned before, they actually managed to capture a Japanese colonel who was Colonel Weech. They managed to capture him alive just before the end of World War II. Now, why is it significant? As Jason mentioned before, very few Japanese officers were captured alive. Most of them would either commit suicide or launch a suicidal attack to avoid that. Now, as I mentioned before, allegedly to some of that history, he was drunk, so that kind of eliminates it. But still, the fact that managed to capture this officer alive is a very unique aspect of any Army combat unit, or even any combat unit in the Pacific Theater. And so, shortly after that, the war ends, and when the war ends, the 32nd Imperial Japanese Army Division actually surrenders to the 93rd. And there's this interesting piece where, like the divisional commander of the 32nd, he surrenders and he requests to keep his sword, and the divisional commander of the 93rd is like, no, we're taking those. We basically don't want to give you any way to continue any wars in the future. Now, when we get to this, we'll talk about kind of the legacy of the 93rd and why this exhibition came out in the first place. Well, when they talk about the 93rd and its service, the 93rd and its service, in my humble opinion, is kind of representative of many black, not only combat units, but a lot of the black units of World War II that had to deal with strifes, the highs and lows of both training as well as stateside, and still managed to serve their country and complete their roles. But like, as I mentioned before, with certain black units that tend to be highlighted, we tend to highlight certain black units that have, like as Jason would say, they meet a certain criteria. So Tuskegee Airmen, they tend to be highlighted because of their effectiveness in battle, but then also a story of fighter pilots and stuff. So they tend to get highlighted. And even with the sister unit, the 93rd, the 92nd, well, even though they kind of have a similar story in terms of controversies and stuff like that, they fought in Europe, so they tend to be highlighted more than the soldiers in the Pacific. But with the Pacific Theater, the 93rd, while it's the largest, it also could represent the experiences of a lot of black soldiers who was in the Pacific. Like you had the 93rd there, you had quite a few combat, definitely a lot of support units that was in the Pacific that witnessed kind of hells of the jungle warfare and everything else. So, Jason, is there anything you want to add?
So one of the things you mentioned was how 93rd was part of the legacy, right? And it very much is that aspect of it. But I want to add a different perspective from Boss Kale, is that the 93rd, I think, in my humble opinion, is that it gave the opportunity to test out the American military's kind of culture, right? The 93rd was designed to be an African American unit that would fight in Europe or fight the enemies of America, right? But at the same time, it had to fight racism, had to fight its own internal kind of structure, because these were African Americans and they had white officers, right? So there was always this internal struggle for combat effectiveness. And I think the story of the 93rd is great in that it tells that despite all the adversity, the struggles of getting there, ultimately what they were able to achieve was to sort of become that unit that people were like, hey, no, these African soldiers don't really fit that classic, the white impression of what a colored unit could do. So these men here were brave enough to not only capture a Japanese colonel, which really hasn't ever been done before, and they were able to showcase one of the most important aspects of it is that it challenges the American military cultural identity, right? The African Americans coming into World War II, they had a lot of faced a lot of problems that this white institution that didn't want. For instance, of course, we always talk about how African Americans weren't really liked in the military, that the white soldiers thought that they were inferior or whatnot against them. They wouldn't really fight alongside them. So the members of the 93rd said, we don't need to fight alongside white soldiers, we can do everything ourselves. And so they went into the Pacific and did their own thing, and they were successful in sort of differentiating themselves between other combat units that were in the Pacific as well.
So when we get to like this artifact right here, this is actually one of my favorite artifacts behind the uniform, and the reason why is because for a few reasons. One, this kind of allows us to talk about the other legacy aspect of not only the 93rd, but a lot of the units that was coming home from World War II. So in the aftermath of World War II, many cities, towns, and states tried to come up with ways to memorialize the service of the men and women who served from their respective areas. And the state of Texas had a book called The Fighting Men of Texas, which was a 5-volume series that comprised of a selection of soldiers who were from Texas that fought in World War II. And the reason we have it open to this page is because in the case of Texas, there was quite a few soldiers that was from the 93rd Infantry Division that served in the unit that was from Texas, and one of them that we were able to find in the book was Cleo Brown, who was from Dallas, Texas. Now, another reason we have this book here too is to try to illustrate the fact that when we do these exhibitions, it is not just a subject matter that's kind of stuck in history. These are actually people's family members who are still around today. And so the idea, well, kind of the fantasy idea I have, is that hopefully before the exhibition closes, that one of his family members come and say, oh, well, hey, that's our uncle, that's my great-grandfather. He was in this unit. And it's kind of to show the fact that with this unit, there was quite a few people that are still touched by this unit on a family level throughout the country. Like in the state, like in fact, since we've opened this exhibition, and we kind of talk about it at the next one, but there's been some descendants of these men and women, these men who was attached to the 93rd who are still around, and the ones that know about it are like, wow, like there's actually some coverage of this unit. And then there's some that those are some like, well, my father was in the Pacific or my uncle was in the Pacific. I don't know what unit he's a part of. And this is where I'm actually happy to be working in the museum with Jason. Like one of our objectives, apart from creating exhibitions and doing tours and among other museum related things, is that when every now and then we have people that come in and say, hey, I had an uncle, I had a grandfather that was in World War II. I just know they was in this theater of operations, and I know they had this photo of them. Can you help me kind of figure out about their history? And in some cases we were able to actually, thanks to resources that we have in the museum as well as others, we were able to find out, hey, like, he was in this unit, he served here, he was there. So that's why we have this artifact in here, is to kind of show that even though we're talking about this unit, there's still a connection to families and communities to this day.
So one of the most important elements of any exhibition now for us is adding that human element in. Previous artifacts, we just saw objects and things, but here we try to add that special touch, right? And that special touch comes in the form of a person. People are often sort of not really classified as, people when they see them as soldiers, right? People take soldiers and they see as soldiers, but in reality, soldiers are people, and each person has a unique experience within and after the military service. And this is what we're trying to show with this example. Daniel Thornton is a great example for that, because of what he's able to achieve during the military service and what happens to him afterwards. And I'll let Cale talk about this gentleman here.
And so the story of Sergeant Daniel Thornton actually starts back in 1920. He was born in Nogales, and his father was an African-American, but his mother was a Mexican-American. And so pretty much he spent his childhood in the area, like basically enjoyed kind of the life of sitting in the area, riding horses and stuff like that. And so when he turns 20, he enlists in the U.S. Army and serves in the 25th Infantry Regiment. And he actually stays in the 25th Infantry Regiment during World War II when they were attached to the 93rd Infantry Division. So he goes through training in Arizona, Louisiana, and California. And then in 1944, he's a part of the 25th Regimental Combat Team when they started doing operations in Bougainville. Now, in terms of what happens while he was at Bougainville, he becomes severely wounded in action. According to unit records, we was kind of able to pinpoint it to it was an operation that occurred, I think it was the night of April 16th, 17th, where apparently there was a defensive perimeter that the 25th Regimental Combat Team had set up, and some Japanese forces were infiltrating it, and when in the process of infiltrating it, they ended up wounding 3 soldiers, and one of the soldiers was Sergeant Daniel Thornton. So he's wounded, and when he is wounded, he spends quite a while in the military hospital recovering from his wounds. Apparently, when he was first sent to the hospital, they actually wrote a letter, got one of his comrades to write a letter to his mother saying, "Hey, I'm well," and basically recovering. And pretty much from that point till 1945, he is medically discharged from the military, and after he's discharged, he actually goes on to marry and actually have a child, but he ends up passing away approximately a year later in late part of 1946 from complications from his war wounds. And I said again, the reason why we have him highlighted is because when you look at his story kind of encompasses the history of the 93rd from pretty much his creation all the way to his service overseas, and then kind of one of the impacts of it. So what's interesting about this exhibition that I really enjoyed was that when we was putting the exhibition together, was talking to Jason, saying that we need to have someone to highlight, and we had these artifacts, and there was talking about Daniel Thornton, but it was primarily about the military side of Daniel Thornton. And did a quick Google search, and turned out his niece whose mother has an interest in history because she was part of the 6th AAA Central Postal Battalion. Her and someone else, they wrote an article about him and his service. And so we reached out to him, and I reached out to him and asked him, "Hey, with your permission, is it okay to include his backstory before he got in the military, and a little bit what happened to him after he got in the military?" And she obliged, and we was able to incorporate that in the object labels and stuff like that. And then the good thing about it is that with this exhibition, there was a few people I wanted to see it before it leaves our museum. I wanted a veteran from the 93rd to see it. I wanted Dr. Robert F. Jefferson, who wrote the book on the 93rd, to see it. And I wanted some descendants from the 93rd to see it. So Miss Moore, she actually came down and visited. And she was actually pretty proud of what we did in terms of her uncle. So I'm actually was glad to actually work with her, and hopefully we can work with her in the future when it comes to other exhibitions as well.
First of all, I want to thank you both for having me here to this museum. This place is amazing. If you're in Houston, you should come see the Buffalo Soldier Museum. If you're not in Houston, you should come to Houston to see the Buffalo Soldier Museum. But what we wanted to do is talk today specifically about this exhibit, about the 93rd, because they really are an example of, from World War I all the way through to World War II, the real experience of these men and what they went through, not only in terms of fighting for this country, which was a country that was not friendly to them, but against the institutionalized systems of racism and socioeconomic challenges that faced them. And we're standing here in front of the case of Sergeant Daniel Thornton Jr., who passed away a year after the war, but he was ultimately killed because of the war. And I think that we're finishing on that, and the last part of this particular exhibit really is exemplary of how important and how sobering these conversations should be. Because these, as you said, these are men, these are people, they're humans, they're soldiers. They went through the issues of being raised in maybe the Jim Crow South, to go to the military, to then go fight and hopefully have some equality come back to, and then find out it's not there. Like, that's kind of the story. But I don't want to end on that note as much as I want to end on a note about how it's important to remember this, and how exhibits like this that you all are both creating are important, and how we have to face this history and do it properly, because not facing it is worse than not talking about it. And hopefully we can do better. But hopefully you enjoyed this. This is the kind of stuff I love to do here, because this one room incorporates an entire narrative and story of an entire struggle for people and individuals. So hopefully you enjoy supporting the channel for that kind of work. Appreciate you all. Patreon.com/InRangeTV. Thank you both for having me here at your museum, and stay tuned for more.